Okay, well, thank you very much for attending this evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, just to remind everyone, today's conference is about the recruiting methods of the British Army during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Okay, so I'm just going to start my notes here. So, the Army's appetite for manpower was almost insatiable. Finding soldiers for a force that peaked at 233,852 officers and men in 1815 was never an easy task. Supply rarely kept pace with demand. During the Napoleonic Wars, annual wastage never fell below 16,071 in 1806 and reached 25,498 in 1812. Recruiting in the British Isles never exceeded the 1808 total of 15,308, and in 1810 there was an abysmal 7,367 men recruited over the year. Even in the 1840s, with a much smaller peacetime army of around 130,000 men, about 1% of the adult male population of the time, simply sustaining it in the face of annual wastage caused by death, incapacity, or routine discharge required the enlistments of between 11 to 12,000 men per year. For most of the period, enlistment was for life, which in practice meant about 25 years, although shorter enlistments were offered in wartime. Thomas Morris, who enlisted in the 73rd Foot in 1812, reported to its major in Colchester and was sent in the care of a sergeant. And I quote, "to the doctor, by whom I was examined and pronounced fit for service." The same sergeant then went with me to the town hall to witness my attestation before the magistrate. They sadly wanted me to enlist for life, but I thought 7 years quite long enough for a trial run. Given the impossibility of finding sufficient British soldiers by conventional means, wartime governments resorted to a variety of expedients. One, as we have often heard, was the large-scale recruitment of foreigners. Another was to encourage enlistments into the regular army from the militia. This required a radical change of policy because it was initially a criminal offence for a man to join the regulars from the militia, and county hierarchies disliked having their armies wilted away. In the first few years of the Napoleonic Wars, service in the militia was more attractive than in the regular army. Although the militia was embodied for full-time service from 1803, it was not compelled to serve abroad, although some militia units did indeed serve abroad in overseas garrisons from time to time. And the families of militiamen were eligible for support from the parish, while those of the regulars were not. By 1803, private individuals who wished to avoid the militia service for which they had been balloted were prepared to pay for a substitute of a fee of up to £25, 3 times the enlistment bounty then offered by the regulars. And by 1812, militia substitutes were pocketing the then incredible sum of £60. In 1803, the Additional Forces Act created a new Army of the Reserve, distinct from the militia, but like it, raised by locally administered ballots. However, battalions of the Army of the Reserve were affiliated to regular regiments in the hope that regiment's reservists would be attracted by the bounty offered if they transferred to the regular service. Benjamin Harris, a young shepherd from Dorset, was caught by the ballot and drafted into the 66th Foot. And I quote, "My father tried hard to buy me off, and would have persuaded the sergeant of the 66th that I was of no use as a soldier, for having maimed my right hand by breaking a forefinger when I was a child. The sergeant, however, said I was just the sort of little chap he wanted, and off he went, carrying me, amongst a batch of recruits he had collected, away with him." End quote. This smacked of conscription for the British public, that terribly French sin, and the scheme was bitterly unpopular as a consequence. And the first ballot raised only 45,492 men, whilst the target was hoped for was 50,000 men. and no fewer than 41,198 of them were substitutes. Of these, 5,651 deserted in the first 10 months, thus rendering themselves liable to compulsory transfer into the regular army if apprehended, and 17,307 joined the regulars. A second ballot in 1805 generated only 7,683 of the expected 29,000 men. And while 3,041 deserted, 8,562 transferred to the regular army. Thereafter, the scheme was quietly shelved, and the remaining men of the Army of the Reserve were forced into garrison battalions, most of which served in Ireland. As one scheme foundered, another flourished. From 1805 onwards, the authorities had increased success in persuading militiamen to join the line. Regular regiments were allowed access to militia units on specific occasions, always provided that they did not, and I quote, disturb the discipline of the men they were visiting. However, it was a carefully calculated application of the stick and carrot when such occasions did occur. And I quote, the militia would be drawn up in line, and the officers or non-commissioned officers from the regiments requiring volunteers would give a glowing description of their several regiments, describing the victories they had gained and the honors they had acquired, and concluded by offering a bounty. If these did not have the required men if these did not have the inquired men, then cohesive measures were adopted, heavy and long drills and field exercises were forced upon them, which became so oppressive that, in order to escape them, the men would embrace the alternative and join the regular army. End quote. So many did indeed embrace this alternative that from 1805, the year that recruiting from the militia was officially authorized by Parliament, about half of the British recruits into the army came from that source. In 1809, William Wheeler was a private in the 2nd Royal Surrey Militia, where his service was made miserable by the tyranny of Major Bloody Bob Hudsoft and the eccentricity of his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lord Cranley. In April, he wrote, I have at length escaped from the militia without being flayed alive. I have taken the first opportunity and volunteered together with 127 of my comrades into the 51st Light Infantry Regiment. I had made up my mind to volunteer, but into what regiment I cared not a straw, so I determined to go with the greatest number. Upwards of 90 men volunteered for the 95th Rifle Regiment. I was near going into this regiment myself, for it was always a fancy corps of mine. And another cause was that Lieutenant Foster, a good officer and beloved by every man in the corps that I had left, volunteered to join that regiment. Here we see several of the key ingredients of volunteering from the militia: dissatisfaction with the militia, peer group pressure, the lure of a fancy corps and a fancy uniform, and the impact of a popular officer. When Wheeler reached the 51st, he found that it contained only about 150 old soldiers. The rest were volunteers from the Stafford, South Gloucester, 1st and 2nd Surrey, together with some half a dozen Irish militias. Edward Costello of the 95th reckoned that recruits from the militia made excellent material for the army, and I quote, it is justly due to the militia regiments to say that in the knowledge and exercise of their military duties during the war, they were very little inferior to the troops of the line. The men who joined our battalion were in general a fine set of young fellows, and chiefly the elite of the light infantry companies of their different provincial corps. All regular recruits were, at least in theory, volunteers. Although many were offered the choice of serving the monarch in a military rather than a penal capacity, if you understand what I mean. The majority of recruits were enticed by the entrancing rattle of the drum and the power of the spoken word, lavishly supported with drink. Colonels of regiments were given beating orders, which authorized them, and I quote, by beat of drum or otherwise, to raise so many men as are to be found wanting. A potential recruit would be given the king's shilling as a mark of his commitment and would then be medically inspected. It has to be said that about 1/3 of recruits failed even this simple examination before being attested by a magistrate. A recruiting party, usually consisting of an officer, 2 sergeants, and a drummer, went to the regiment's recruiting area, set themselves up in a selection of prominent spots where the drummer beat the points of wars. This full repertoire of flans and rattles with some fancy stick clicking thrown in for good measure. And the officer and sergeants would talk about the unrivaled opportunities to be had by volunteering for their regiments. Posters describe the attractions that awaited. There's one left for you on the support conference area if you wish to look at it. I have another that is dated 1814 for the 7th Light Dragoon, which announces, "Young fellows whose hearts beat high to tread the paths of glory could not have a better opportunity than now offers. Come forward then and enroll yourselves in a regiment that stands unrivaled, and where the kind treatment of the men experienced is known throughout the whole kingdom. N.B. This regiment is mounted on blood horses, and being lately returned from Spain and the horses young, the men will not be allowed to hunt during the next season more than once a week." 3 years before this poster, another from the 69th Foot noted that a few dashing and high-spirited young men wanted, those hearts beat high to tread the paths of glory. Young men of this description know the opportunity offered to them, which may never occur again, of enlisting into one of the finest regiments in the service. Should, after all this, there still be a few young men of high character who had somehow remained civilians, then in would come the 14th Light Dragoon poster that went as such: "You have the exclusive right to wear the black or imperial eagle of Prussia. Your horses are of matchless beauty. Your clothing and accoutrements highly attractive. And smart young Britons inspired with military ardor, whose noble and warlike minds are repugnant to the control of unfeeling relatives and friends, have now the glorious prospect of speedy preferment, and 2 additional troops are to be raised." And just in case there was any misunderstanding, this poster ended with "NB, smart young Irishman taken." In 1812, a recruiting sergeant, Thomas Jackson of the Coldstream Guards, found that recruits' martial ardor soon faded. I quote, "Some of them, after sober reflection, repented and said by the way, 'Sergeant, you are leading us to the slaughterhouse.' I laughed them out of it, but perhaps they were right." Although he complained that he himself disliked recruiting, he then carried on to describe it. I quote again, "We had to take a drum and fife and attend all the wakes, races, and revels within 20 miles of London. There we had to strut about in our best coats and swaggering sword in hand, drumming our way through them. In April 1795, there was a riot in Westminster when a recruiting sergeant gave a youth a shilling and told him to buy some tobacco in a nearby shop. The gullible lad did as he was told, and when he returned, and I quote, the fellow instantly seized him and told him that he had taken the king's money and must go for a gentleman's soldier. The boy's yells brought a crowd, which took the sergeant to the parish pump and attempted to purify him with water. Luckily for the sergeant, he managed to escape. Whether he was induced to believe that he was becoming a gentleman soldier or not, an inquisitive young man was vulnerable the minute he stopped to talk to a recruiting sergeant. One of these admitted that if honest means failed, again I quote, "Your last resort is to get him drunk and then slip a shilling into his pocket. Get him home to your billet, and next morning swear he enlisted. Bring all of your party to prove it. Get him persuaded to pass the doctor. Should he pass, you must use every means in your power to get him to drink more, blow him up with a fine story, get him in front of the magistrates in some shape or other, and get him attested, but by absolutely no means are you to let him out of your hands. Drink, usually alcoholic, played a key role in the pro-recruiting process of the British Army. Benjamin Harris had already served a short term with the 66th Foot when he met a recruiting party of the 95th Rifles in Ireland. They looked so dashing that he signed on at once, and the group, recruiters and recruits alike, then set off for merry England. I quote the start of their journey. We started our journey in tip-top spirits from the Royal Oak in Cashel, the whole lot of us, early as it was, being 3 sheets to the wind already. When we paraded before the door of the Royal Oak, the landlord and landlady of the inn, who were quite as lively, came reeling forth with 2 tankards of whisky, which they thrust into the hands of the sergeants, making them a present of the decanters, and all to carry along with them, and refresh themselves on the march. The piper then struck up, the sergeants flourished the decanters, and the whole commenced their march with a terrific yell. We can't say that much has changed. Young men were offered a bounty, whose size reflected the demand for recruits at the time, in order to enlist. In 1803, the bounty was about £7, 12 shillings and sixpence, and had risen to 12 guineas by 1805. The sum payable to the recruit was only part of the bargain, for the recruiting officer received another 16 shillings, his recruiting party 15 shillings, and the bringer, often a landlord who had got the man drunk in the first place, £2, 12 shillings and sixpence. Harris admitted that after 3 days' drunken riot, as he put it, the bounty was spent in every sort of excess till all was gone. Sometimes a soldier deserted as soon as he got his bounty, and by the 1840s there was one author that called on a vicious circle of ignorance and cruelty and double dealing, from which even the well-meaning officers or soldiers could not escape. Recruiting sergeants worked closely with the bringers, and young men who fled after being conned into taking the shilling were then pursued by other men who were rewarded for recapturing them. Parallels with the runaway slaves in America and the men who hunted them down could be called here. Not all recruits who deserted were innocent men, of course. Some soldiers made a career of making off with their bounty. During his first enlistment, Harris recalls, a man of the 70th Regiment who had deserted that corps and afterwards enlisted into several other regiments. Indeed, I was told at the time that 16 different times he had received the bounty and then went off. Being, however, caught at last, he was brought to trial at Portsmouth and sentenced by General Court-Martial to be shot. It was thought that the execution would be a good hint to us young'uns. Harris, incidentally, formed part of the 16-man firing party, composed of 4 soldiers from 4 regiments, which shot him. Edward Costello joined the 95th Rifles from the Dublin militia in 1807. He received the 18 guineas paid to those who joined from the militia, only to discover that £4 was immediately taken off him for his kit. He was luckier than most recruits, who found that by the time they had provided drinks for the recruiting party, given the drummer his fee for beating the points of war, bought the traditional ribbons for the sergeant's wife, had very little left. Costello was a quick learner. He accompanied the recruiting party, clad in an old green coat of the sergeant's, before joining his regiment. The coat attracted the interest of a man who asked what bounty was given, and then announced that he would join if he was given the shilling. Costello did not have one to hand. I quote, however, knowing that we received £2 for every recruit, I hurried into a public house near at hand and requested of the landlord to lend me a shilling, telling him the use for which I wanted it. This he very kindly did, and I handed it over to the recruit, who, chucking it instantly on the counter, called for the worth of it in whisky. While we remained drinking, the sergeant, who I had sent for, arrived, and supplied me with money. The recruit passed the doctor and was sworn into our corps. His name was Wilkie, and he was an Englishman. For a few artisans who lacked the money or interest to secure a commission, but that did not want to join the army as private soldiers, there was the possibility of joining a discrete and small number of specialist NCOs. One such example is Thomas Bennett. Born in Kent as one of 22 children in 1782, he was a saddler by trade. And in 1804, he had heard that Lieutenant Colonel Bolton of the 13th Light Dragoon needed a master saddler. He was told that so long as he was steady, all would be well. But in the event of any misconduct, he would be court-martialed and reduced to the ranks. He decided to take the risk and enlisted on Christmas Eve, receiving a bounty of £13 8 and the rank of sergeant. He did exceptionally well, keeping a library of over 100 books and owning a violin which he rashly lent to the bandmaster for, and I quote, "the rascal pawned it." Unfortunately, he eventually took to drink, and shortly after the Battle of Waterloo, visited Vauxhall Gardens and got, and I quote, "pretty well drunk. On the road home, I fell in with some banditti that gave me a complete thrashing which sobered me up, so that I got home and was put immediately to bed, which I did not leave for some days after." Things went from bad to worse after the regiment was posted to India in 1818. And after receiving a disagreeable form of corporal punishment, he had been bridled and driven around the riding school, but allowed to retain his rank, he was invalidated out of the army. That concludes my conference about the recruitment of the British Army. I will now take a look at any questions that are on the board. There are no questions on the board, so you are invited if you have any questions to give them verbally.
I'll do one. So my master's was on the Fencibles, so 1790s into
Yes.
1802 rather than post 1803. But something that I came across quite a lot of was that the Fencibles certainly, and something that the militia would play off the regular fervor. So would use the general sort of patriotism, general interest in the army to spur recruitment for the other sectors. Did you find that for post 1803 as well?
In post 1803, no, I did not find this. Bearing in mind, I think the Fencible experience did not last much after that, did it?
Oh no, but so for example, the militia or the reservists, would they use for example, an area particularly enthralled with the military? Would that be used to trigger recruiting for them, or was it a separate? You're with a militia, we're very different, and a different recruitment base.
I didn't find that with the militia. What comes across for a lot of people who did join from the militia, notably, well, one person explained it really well. He was a man that was in a Scottish militia battalion, and he volunteered to join the 42nd Highlanders, and he explained in his memoirs to his friend at the time that in the militia he served, in essence, with life and limb safe, but very little opportunity for advancement or for a revenue and income in his old age. So he decided to join the regulars, because he knew that if he managed to stay the course, he would, in essence, become a Chelsea pensioner, whether in or out, but he would receive some sort of financial compensation until the rest of his life once he had been retired from service. That did also come across in a few other militiamen's memoirs, this need for a steady income, basically, after when you get into your old age.
Okay, so it was that's interesting.
And of course, a lot of the men, as they said, were just basically driven to madness to join, because if the regulars did not have enough men that particular day, then they would just make you drill and drill and drill and drill, and at the end of it, I suppose you go stark raving mad and, yeah, okay, I'll join, just stop drilling me, please.
I say.
Indeed. So this is why I put inverted commas around the word the British Army was a purely volunteer force. Yes, absolutely. This was purely volunteers. None of them were obliged to sign. These were all voluntarily signed up. However, there's a lot of arm twisting in the background as far as I can tell.
Fair enough.
Any other questions?
What's the difference between the militia and the fencibles?
Can
I think Rory can do that one.
The Fencibles, I've just posted the bounty poster that Mark talked about earlier into the questions chat for a Fencible regiment. The Fencibles were volunteer only. They weren't militia. They couldn't be. The militia were balloted. The militia, it was a ballot done of the whole county. This village has to contribute X number of men. You take a ballot. So militia were balloted, were effectively conscripted. Fencibles were volunteers. They had to volunteer, and their service was restricted to the British Isles. But so they were the regulars. They were paid by the regulars. They were administered by the regulars. Their drill book literally says in at the beginning, "See the regular book." So the Fencibles were basically this not home guard, but territorial version of the regular army. The militia were conscripts. It's the difference.
Correct. They were basically the British Army regulars, but permanently home-based.
Yeah, they did go abroad in the end. They ended up being sent to Gibraltar, and
if they all voted to go, they could go. They were there's some Fencible regiments. They even served in Wellington's army in the Pyrenees in 1813. We have. I'll give you I'll try and find the reference and send it to you.
Thank you.
Steve K says, may an ancient soldier be recruiting again by same methods for new soldiers? Okay, I think he means, could an old soldier be recruited? If an old soldier was expelled or cashed out of his regiment, could he be recruited again into another regiment? Is that what you're trying to say? I take it that's what he's trying to say. So the answer to that is absolutely. There are, for example, notably in the Chasseurs Britanniques regiments, when this regiment was disbanded in 1814, there are a lot of men who actually then signed on deliberately into another regiment and once again got a bounty for it. So yes, if you were an old soldier and you were honorably discharged but could still serve, there was nothing stopping you finding a recruiting party of another regiment and joining that one. It's about veteran recruiting. Did I manage to answer that question for you, Steve? Oh, he's just writing.
Allô, allô, allô?
Yes, Steve. Yes, Steve. Hi.
Hi. Je te la refais en français. Est-ce que un vétéran peut être recruté, un vétéran hors service, bien sûr, un ancien soldat peut être recruté par les mêmes méthodes, simplement puisqu'il aura lu avec un vieux sergent. Tu te souviens de moi, j'étais à Waterloo et voilà, qu'est-ce qu'on a vécu? Oh, tiens, t'as le chimique droit dans le.
So just to say in English, yes, the question, Steve's question was indeed, if an old soldier who had been honorably discharged, who had left the army, could he be recruited again by the same methods? The answer is oui, tout à fait. Il pourrait être licencié de son régiment ou quitter le régiment au bout de son contrat, et puis plus tard trouver un sergent recruteur et à nouveau signer dans l'armée et recevoir une nouvelle prime. Tout à fait. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the bottom of the poster, where it says bringers of handsome volunteers will be most liberally rewarded.
Indeed, yes.
Is that meant to be like in addition to the general recruitment message, or is that just their way of making it look a bit sexy?
That's their way of telling people, if you know someone who would be a good soldier or would be looking to be a soldier and you bring him to us, not only will we give him a bounty, but you will also get a bit of the cake.
Thank you.
No problem. The French army also applied the same methods under the old regime as well. in fact, the British Army recruitment of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars is more or less the recruitment of the French army prior to the Revolution.
Not a question, but a sort of fun, because I've looked into sort of militias a bit as well, and there is one instance I found, one singular rare instance of the militia being sent abroad, which was not the designed purpose of the militia. Now, they weren't ever in action, I don't think. It's something I want to look into further for my own research, but the Marquess of Buckingham was put in charge of a composite battalion made of like several militia companies, as it were. And from what I've found, they were sent to Bordeaux sort of around the time that the British freed it in 1814. So I don't think they saw any action and were simply there as sort of showing off British patriotism is the only reason I can think of these brave militiamen volunteering to go and serve on the continent, even though all the fighting had finished.
Yes, I think probably then in that case, the militias you've been looking at are the militias probably I've heard of, because Wellington does mention 3 composite battalions of militiamen coming over in the Pyrenees region. So I reckon you've probably found all the data that Rory needs, or most of it. But indeed, it does. There was always the possibility of militia units to serve abroad. They had to vote for it. The members of the unit had to all unanimously vote to go abroad, and then yes, government would let them go abroad, same as the Fencibles, really. At the same, and I would agree with you in this particular case. It's very courageous to say you've gone out in 1814 on the continent when the fighting's all but done, and I probably suspect the Duke of Wellington never dreamed of taking these militia battalions into his regular army, but probably put them in some garrisons, Bayonne or Bordeaux in the area, just to keep them busy with and out of mischief. This also draws a bit of similar parallels, not complete parallels, with a lot of Frenchmen at the end of World War II who suddenly all joined the resistance movement right at the end of the war. So I think we can see some sort of parallel there, even though it's not 100% transposable one onto the other. But yes, definitely, if militia regiments voted, a complete vote, unanimous vote to go abroad, they were permitted to go abroad, and some did.
Cool, yeah. If you have anything on that particular instance in 1814, I'd be very interested if you could send me any of that, because the Royal Buckinghamshire Militia, which is my local militia, my local history, very peak. If you have anything regarding that, I'd be.
I don't have much, but I'll give you what I have. I'll just have to dig it out.
All right, yeah, brilliant, thanks.
No problem.
Also,
no, there was Axel also who posted a question, so I was just going to go to see him. Axel asks, can we see, I suppose that's supposed to be say, bounty jumpers? It is not bounty jumpers. Voir. Oh, okay. But if you're asking, was the term bounty jumpers used at the time to describe these people? Yeah, exactly. A man who deserts and then joins another one and deserts that one just for the bounty. I have not come across it. I've not come across it in Costello or Harris or any other memoirs that makes reference to this practice. The usual words associated are rascal, scoundrel, that sort of thing. So I've not come across it in the memoirs of the soldiers. Could it be used as a modern term? I suppose, if everybody knew what you were talking about. So from what I can gather, it's not a period term, but maybe it's a modern term.
I can say I'll have a look as well. I'll go through the 8 or 9 I've got on the shelf and see if there's any mention.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Axel? No problem. Grover, you were going to say something?
This is simply a fun addition because I have a very sort of rare autobiography by a member of the militia, which sort of shows how similar lifestyles were had. So he was on furlough in 1812, and he writes, I rode from London on the coach, and the weather being cold and I had plenty of money, I drank a great deal of brandy, so that I became intoxicated, and when I came to Woodbridge, I went to a public house, which was infested with bad girls of the common sort, and being drunk, and my time not being out till the next night, I was easily led away with one of them, though I had never given up myself to them before. At this time, I gave myself up to all manner of vice and folly, and retained no more sobriety and prudence than just enough to maintain my duty. So I think the sort of so that's from the autobiography of Joseph Mayett of Quainton, 1783 to 1839.
I suppose that's one form of lads' night out in those in those days. That's the only thing I can say. But yes, it seems drink does have a very central role in this process. I haven't come across anyone talking about the ladies as such. This is the first time I've heard about it, but the way it's described is pretty unique, I'll say. Let's see. There's a question from Enzo. Can we say that the means used by the recruiting sergeants are immoral? I quoted during the conference the guidelines of the guidebook that so recruiting sergeants were given, and the rules themselves are very explicit. It's you get the young man drunk. You tell him a good story about glory and flag waving and all sorts of wonderful things to make sure he doesn't change his mind. You make sure he doesn't sober up, and you get him signed in as quickly as possible. From our modern point of view, we could argue that it's immoral, though I would argue there are a lot of decisions that notably young men take when they are intoxicated that might not be the best and that they regret even to this day. I suppose no. We can't say they were immoral simply because they were sanctioned, they were validated, and I haven't come across anybody who went up against the magistrate and said I drank too much at the time, or I was forced to do it. So, judging by the lack of evidence of enlistments being overturned by the courts, I would say that this was basically part and parcel of the recruiting process at the time. So immoral by our standards, sure. Immoral by their standards, I would not think so. I would also add, Enzo, that the question of morality is very interesting because at the time, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic armies they relied on a compulsory mandatory conscription system, as did other armies throughout the continent. Eventually, the British never took that up. And from the British, when you read the British newspapers and you study the British psyche at the time, this mandatory conscription was seen as something very negative, very offensive, very immoral. So for the British, the conscription system adopted by the French was incredibly immoral as a way of getting recruits, which is interesting. And just to finish that, if you know the sea shanty Heart of Oaks, Heart of Oak is a Napoleonic, even earlier song, and I believe that the first verse talks about that, where they say, "We invite you to glory. We don't press you like slaves," or something like that. So even in the popular rhetoric of the time, It's again, you're volunteers. You are not pressed like slaves. The slave is forced. The slave has no choice. The volunteer is not a slave. Therefore, a volunteer is British. There's another question. If the soldiers are engaged through schemes, do we see a low motivation and moral? The answer to that is absolutely yes. When we look at the scheme of the Army of the Reserve, it failed miserably with a lot of desertions. So those who finally, in that particular scheme, yes, that was a total failure. The soldiers were not motivated, no morale, and probably they were not did not make very good soldiers. The second scheme, where they recruited from the militia, even the professional soldiers themselves believed that the militiamen were more or less on the same, could more or less be relied upon as the line. They were as good as the regular soldiers of the line. So I would say that this did not impact the standard, the morale or the motivation of the standard British units. No, it definitely, the militiamen that volunteered definitely did not do that. There we go. Does that answer your question, Enzo? Thank you, Enzo. And thank you, Grover and Rory, for the
J'ai une question.
citation. Oui, yes.
Est-ce que le système de test de la Navy était en concurrence avec le système de recrutement de l'armée? Et est-ce que surtout, en fait, des soldats pouvaient involontairement se retrouver embarqués sans le vouloir? À partir du moment où ils sont à bord des navires et qu'ils sont partis, est-ce que ça pose est-ce que du coup, posait pas un petit problème? Tu vois ce que je veux dire?
So Steve's question basically is, was there not some sort of competition between the recruiters of the Royal Navy and the recruiters of the Army? And as a side question is, could a soldier find himself awake one day on board one of His Majesty's ships? I'll do the answer in English first, and then I'll quickly do it in French. The simple answer is yes, there was a form of competitiveness. However, the press gangs, the Navy employed press gangs to get their men, and they were usually in the taverns of seaside towns. And the recruiting parties usually stayed well away from the areas used by the Royal Navy for their press gangs. Principally because, yes, there was the chance maybe that a recruiting sergeant in a seaside tavern could get hit over the head and find himself on board His Majesty's ships. So they gave the press gangs a wide berth. Pour faire en français, il y avait une concurrence, oui et non. En fait, la marine royale britannique recrute surtout dans les ports, et surtout sur le littoral du port, tout ce qui est le port immédiat, les tavernes, etc. Et les recruteurs de l'armée savaient très bien de laisser cette zone aux recruteurs de la marine. Simplement pour les raisons dont ont été déjà évoquées là, juste à l'instant. En effet, il n'y avait rien qui empêchait un sergent recruteur qui se trouvait au mauvais endroit de recevoir un coup de marteau ou de masse sur la tête et de se retrouver à bord un des bateaux de Sa Majesté. Donc, non, en effet, il y avait une certaine compétition, mais l'armée ne va pas empiéter sur les terres de la marine parce qu'il se pourrait bien que ça se retourne contre elle. Oh, okay, he said he understood the answer in English. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, we've got Alex just writing a question. Moi, j'ai rien compris. Peux-tu recommencer depuis tout le début de la conférence française? I didn't understand anything. Can you start from the beginning in French?
C'est une blague. Merci.
Yeah, it's a blague, it's a joke. The conference will be in French. We will record it we will do it again in French. I need to translate everything again, but voilà, c'est prévu en français la semaine prochaine si j'arrive à trouver un peu de temps.
Ouais, pas de souci, Marc, merci.
Je t'en prie. Any other questions?
I was just going to ask as well, Mark. Could I grab a copy of your written notes, if that's okay, or is that?
At the moment, they're just scribbled down on a piece of paper, and sometimes I misunderstood my own handwriting. What I could invite you to do, if you're inclined, is if you want my French language article about this subject is on Facebook. If you want to take that and then back translate it and then brush up the translation, that's fine. Otherwise, I would write up the notes nice and neat for you. But it might just take a little bit of time.
I'll see how I do with the published version. Thank you very much.
No problem. You'll find it on the page of the Chasseur Britannique.
Yes. Yes. Thanks, Guillaume. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? D'autres questions, les gars? Okay, well, I think in that case, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for your attention, gentlemen. Thank you, Guillaume, for inviting me. This is my first conference, and I thought it was going to be in French up until a week ago. So I had to quickly change the language on that. If you do come up with any other questions, feel free to drop an email or send me a message, and I'll see what I can do. Okay? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.